Chapter 5. Jake didn't work anymore that evening, giving Addie his complete attention. He did the dishes, and they sat together on the couch talking. "When do I get to see your store?" he asked. He was being polite, and he was certain she knew it. He really did want to see the store eventually, but he didn't have time right away. Hopefully she wouldn't mind if he waited a few weeks. She shrugged. "It can wait until you're ready for your break, I guess." She wanted him to see it, but now that she understood his routine better, she could wait the 3 weeks until he was ready to take a long break. "My parents are expecting us for dinner after church on Sunday." She hoped it didn't make him angry that she'd agreed without checking with him. He wanted to groan, but he didn't. "Okay. Do you want to go to church as well? Or just go over there after they're out?" He would go to church if she wanted him to, but he was more of a solitary worshiper. He needed the time to work on his manuscript, but he owed it to her to do what she wanted on that. He should have explained his work routine while they were on their honeymoon, instead of waiting for her to see it. "I'd like to go if you don't mind. I've always attended church regularly, and it would feel weird if I didn't." She turned more fully toward him so she could see his face during their discussion. He nodded. "That works. And then how long will we be at your parents' after church?" How long would he be away from his work? He was going to lose at least half a day, from what he could tell. If he could keep up the pace he had going, the whole book would be done by Sunday evening. Maybe he could get some extra words in before that. She frowned. "Do you want to board up the door and live here like a hermit?" Was he really that work-driven, or was he antisocial as well? That was exactly what he wanted, but he was certain she didn't want to hear it. "Not all the time. I mean, there's time for going out and being around friends. Most of the time I want to be home with just you, though. Or alone." He loved being with her, but he needed more alone time than he was getting. Probably because he was involved in his book. During his week off, he'd be craving her attention while she worked. She laughed. "I'm honestly surprised you want me around. I was certain you would want to be here alone, pounding away at your computer while I was at work." He sighed. "Of course I want you around. I think you're pretty amazing." He leaned forward and kissed her softly. "I'll try not to make you feel that way again." He needed to be better about showing her he wanted her around, whether he did or not. He knew his thoughts were unfair. He did want her there. He just didn't want to feel like he had to stop what he was doing for her. "How fast do you type?" she asked. He frowned at the quick change in subject. He would never understand the female mind. Never. 115 words per minute. Why? She blinked a few times. "I had no idea it was even possible to type that fast. When you were typing last night, it sounded like a machine gun, so I decided to ask you." He shrugged. "I took typing in high school, and then again in college. My professor in college walked up behind me during the first day of class when I was typing a paper, and she said she was going to fail me on principle." He half smiled at the memory of it. "What principle is that?" She couldn't just decide to fail someone the first day of class. She was ready to go hunt down his teacher and tell him she was evil for even saying it. He shook his head. She was joking. "She said it because I was already typing faster than she did." Addie laughed. "Then why did you take the class?" "That's nuts. I needed another elective, and it was an easy A. Was there nothing you took for an easy A?" She grinned. "Yeah, I guess there were a couple of classes. Everyone does that." He was right. Everyone took electives that were easy for them. It was the way of the college world. "What did you take, because it was easy for you?" "Me? I took an English history class from the Roman Empire to the Tudors. It was so much fun for me. I read the book before the class even started, and then I read it several more times too." She shrugged. I still have it. He looked at her as if she'd grown two heads. Most people take easy stuff for their electives. What were you thinking? He didn't hate history, but that sounded ridiculously complicated. I was thinking that all my classes were business, and I love history. What else? She knew it was an odd choice for an elective, but she wasn't going to apologize for it. You're crazy, my dear wife. She leaned forward and kissed him softly. You have voices in your head that tell you what to write, and you call me crazy? Are you kidding me? She'd never heard of a blacker pot calling a kettle black. He pulled her onto his lap and kissed her, touching her through the thin fabric of her pajamas. Are you sure you don't want to put your new nightgown on for me? He asked, nibbling her ear with his teeth. Why? This isn't sexy enough for you? He laughed as he looked at her pajama shirt that proclaimed her the queen of everything. There are sexier things you could wear, but really? This works for me. His hand slid under the shirt and he stroked her breast. Want me to demonstrate? Isn't that what you're already doing? Asterisk. Addie called Savannah the next morning on her way to work. She had nothing else to do on the 45-minute subway ride. He's going to make me crazy, she said as soon as the other woman answered. Laughter came back to her over the line. This must be Addie. Yeah, Jake is a special kind of snowflake. He can't figure out what day of the week it is half the time. If you need him to do something, tape a note to the corner of his computer, and set off 5 different alarms throughout the house. Scott said that's what he had to do when they were roommates in college and Jake was working on his first book. Now Scott just goes over there and gets his attention. Or he did before he moved to Manhattan, of course. Tell me what was hard about your marriage. You seem to be doing very well now. Savannah had made it clear at the reception something had happened when she first married Scott. Whatever that something was might help her deal with Jake. Savannah sighed. You know, Scott is a clueless man. He thought I should stay home and cook all day, because that's what his mother did. I hope you quickly disillusioned him of that. Addie was glad Jake didn't have any of those misconceptions. Savannah laughed. We had a fight about it, but decided I would cook through the summer, but I'd go to work in the fall. I'm a teacher. Anyway, about a week later, he gave me a present. It was wrapped in Christmas paper and had thick dust on it. When I asked him who it was originally for, he said it was for his mother, who had died a few years prior to that. And when I opened it? It was a KitchenAid mixer. I would have gotten over it quickly if he hadn't told me the following morning that I must have PMS to be in such a bad mood. Addie choked with laughter. Oh, you have got to be kidding me. Yes, Scott is clueless all right. Jake isn't clueless, but he seems absent, if that makes sense. I mean, I understand becoming involved in work, but he's going way overboard. She wasn't certain how she would have reacted to being told she had PMS, but she might have set out to prove it. That's Jake. Give him a chance and use the alarm clock trick. Well, for today, I started a meal in the crock pot, so he wouldn't have to remember to get up and cook. He was supposed to start supper at 7 yesterday evening, and didn't bother. I had it all ready in the fridge. He just had to pop it in the oven. And he forgot? He never even heard me ask, even though he agreed to do it. That was the frustrating thing for Addie. If he hadn't agreed to do it, she'd have been fine with him not hearing her. But his agreement? That meant he was deliberately ignoring her. Savannah sighed. Yeah, you have to ask him to repeat what you said back to you, or he won't even know the conversation happened. That's what he told me, Addie said. I think it's ridiculous, but I'll do it if it means he'll remember. She looked up and realized she was already at her stop. All right, thanks for the chat. I won't kill him tonight. Good. Scott would be lost without him. Addie smiled. I'm getting off the subway and walking to the store now. We'll have to talk again soon. She could tell she was going to like Savannah just as soon as they had time to really get to know each other. If it gets too crazy, call Dr. Lachele. She gave me really good advice when I wanted to hurt Scott for his cluelessness. I will call her if I need to. Thanks again. She ended the call and stuck her phone in her purse. She had a long day ahead of her, and she didn't need to be worrying about her husband. It was time to focus on her business. Asterisk. Their week went much smoother after that first day. Jake did his best to go to bed when she did, but he would sneak out of bed in the middle of the night to get more work done. He was at the point where he needed to just finish this book so he could write the next one that was screaming at him. He wasn't so much money-driven as he was work-driven. He genuinely loved everything about his job, and it was hard for him to stop even though he knew he should. Addie made breakfast every morning before she left for work, and he did his best to sit down with her to eat every evening, instead of eating at his computer while he wrote. He wondered if she knew what kind of sacrifice he was making. At least she worked 6 days per week, and he wouldn't have to worry about her always being there trying to talk to him when he needed to be working. When she got home from work on Friday night, she sank down onto the couch and rubbed the back of her neck. It had been a really long week. She was used to sharing the cooking with her roommates, and now she was doing it all. It would have been nice if Jake had done more since he was the one home all day, and she was bringing in the bulk of their income, but watching him work, she could tell that he truly wasn't capable of doing more around the house than he did. Once she got his attention, she said, "Do you want to go out to dinner tonight? I didn't start anything before work." He frowned. He really didn't want to take that much time away from his book, but he hadn't left the apartment since they got home on Sunday evening either. Sure, that would be fine. Where do you want to go? She shrugged. We could just start walking and see what we see. Manhattan is so pretty at night. He hated the idea of being gone that long, but he reluctantly agreed. He still felt like he owed her for the incident on Monday. We can do that. He looked down at himself. Let me get a shower first? She nodded. Sounds good. This is a new area of the city for me, and I don't know it as well, so I'll just see what I can find close to here. Once he was in the shower, she pulled out her phone and frowned at the small screen. It would be easier if she just used his computer. She could get her laptop out, but why? His was right there. The words he was writing caught her eye immediately. The Sorcerers of Mithria. He's my favorite writer. I married Roger Holiday. Holy moly. As soon as the words crossed her lips, she was angry. He'd acted as if he made a pittance from his work, but she'd seen articles talking about the $1 million deal he'd gotten for his last book. The Sorcerers of Mithria was one of the most popular series in science fiction. Why would he lie to her? She moved back to the couch and did the search on her phone, leaving his computer the way she'd found it. She thought about confronting him, but decided instead to ask him questions about his work and see how much he'd tell her. He must have seen his books on her shelf and known she was a fan. She felt like an idiot. She'd married her favorite writer and had no clue. She did her quick search and found a small restaurant not far from the apartment with good ratings and decent prices. Not that she needed to worry about prices when she was married to Roger Holiday. What had he been thinking, hiding his true identity from her? She had herself under control before he emerged from the bathroom with a towel wrapped around his waist. He was fresh-shaven and looked good to her. Not so good that she didn't still want to slap him, though. She worked hard to keep her face impassive. She couldn't show how angry she was until she was ready to confront him. Do I need a suit for this place? Or jeans? Slacks and a nice shirt is good, she answered automatically. I'm just wearing my work clothes. She wore a pair of slacks and a nice blouse, but nothing terribly fancy. He nodded and disappeared into the bedroom, coming out a few minutes later, ready to go. Did you make reservations? No, they don't take them at this place. When they left the apartment, she locked the door. Did I give you a key yet? She had two, but one might still be in her jewelry box. He shook his head. Not yet. I haven't gone anywhere on my own. I'm sure I will eventually. Like as soon as he finished his book. He was going to go and get her the biggest bouquet of flowers she'd ever seen, just to thank her for putting up with him while he wrote. And keeping him fed. That was a big deal as well. He took her hand as they walked through the busy streets. The restaurant is only about 3 blocks away, so it's not far. I hope you like Italian. She really didn't care if he liked the food or not. At that point, he'd better eat it and do it with a smile. She wouldn't be responsible for her actions otherwise. I love Italian. I really love New York Italian, because it seems so authentic. Now that he was out of the apartment, he was thrilled to be out looking at all the people. Every person he met ended up in a book somehow. It wasn't usually a whole person, more just a piece of every person. It's usually very authentic. Often the cook will come out and yell at the servers in Italian. It's fun to watch. She stopped walking. Here it is. They went into the small restaurant and were seated quickly. She picked up her menu. She'd wait to start their discussion until after they had ordered. It's not a good sign that there was no wait on a Friday night, she said, a bit worried about her choice. He shrugged. We're eating late. It's after 8:30. I'm sure everyone is off doing other things by now. Do you mind eating so late? She asked, glancing at him over the top of her menu. Not that they had a choice. The store didn't close until 6, and she didn't make it home until 7. If they wanted to eat out, they had to do it late. Oh, not at all. I enjoy eating any time I remember to. She read over the menu selections and closed her menu, waiting patiently for him to do the same. When he set his menu down, he reached across the table and took her hand. Tell me about the book you're writing, she urged. He shrugged. Oh, it's just a boring science fiction book. Dragons and princesses in a faraway land. Nothing to write home about. He chose his words carefully, not wanting to give away his identity. He had seen his books on the shelf in her room, so he knew she was a fan. Unsure of why he didn't want her to know yet, he assumed it was just because he enjoyed the illusion of having a wife who cared about him because she liked him. Not because of money. Of course, he knew he should have already told her, and he would soon. When he figured out how. Really? Sounds fascinating. What will you call it? She leaned forward in her chair as she asked, making sure he knew she was extremely interested. I haven't decided yet. Really? She asked. I'd heard that the next Roger Holiday book would be called Dancing with Dragons. Did I read wrong? His eyes widened, and he frowned. How'd you find out? Does it really matter? It was easy to put 2 and 2 together and add up to the fact that my husband is a lying pig. The waiter stopped at their table, looking back and forth between them as if he'd heard what Addie had said. Can I get you some drinks? He asked, looking like he was almost afraid to interrupt the conversation. I'll have a Sprite, please, she said sweetly, not looking at Jake. Coke. The waiter nodded. I'll be right back with your drinks and to get your order. He hurried away, obviously not wanting to be any part of the conversation taking place. Addie, you have to believe me. I never meant to hide it from you, but when women discover that I'm Roger Holiday, they all go insane and immediately profess undying love for me. I wanted you to get a chance to know me, Jake, and not be worried about how much money I make or what kind of books I write. She shook her head. And did I pass your test? Am I good enough to be married to the great Roger Holiday? He sighed. Please don't be angry with me. How could I not be angry with you? Every single book you've ever written is on my shelf at home. You knew I was a fan, and you never said anything. Our whole marriage is built on a lie. I never meant to lie to you. He hadn't been thinking about how she'd feel about his deception. He'd only been worried about making certain her feelings were real. She shrugged. A meaningful lie and a lie by omission result in the same thing. They're both lies. He shook his head. I just wanted you to have a chance to get to know me, Jake. It's hard for everyone I meet to know I'm Roger Holiday and expect me to act accordingly. He closed his eyes for a moment, worried this was something she wouldn't be able to forgive him for. It had never really occurred to him just how angry she'd get. I'm really sorry I deceived you. Can you forgive me? I honestly don't know. You're my husband, the man I'm supposed to spend the rest of my life with, and I'd just found out you lied to me for the first 2 weeks of our marriage. It's a hard pill to swallow. She'd been raised to always forgive. God forgave all of her sins. And she probably could forgive. But could she trust again? I'll do whatever I can to make it up to you. I swear. His eyes pled with her to understand. She sighed. It's not about making it up to me. It's about whether or not I can trust you again. She eyed him skeptically. Is there anything else you're not telling me? I can contribute a lot more than $2,000 a month to our living expenses, he said with a half grin, knowing that would be good news and not bad. I have a house in Montana that I'm not sure if I'll sell. My parents deeded it to me when I graduated from college. Is that all? I don't get a discount at my friend's place in South Dakota. He expects me to pay full price. He racked his brain for anything else that he could have lied about, either by omission or on purpose. I think that's all. If I can think of anything else you need to know, I'll tell you right away. She sighed. Where do we go from here? He shrugged. You tell me. I need to finish my book I'm working on, but it'll be done soon. After that, I'll take a week off, and we'll have some extra time together. Does that work? I guess. She didn't know how to explain how hurt she felt about his deceit. Especially when the fangirl inside her was dancing with joy. She was married to her favorite writer. I rearranged my schedule, so I'll have Saturdays and Sundays off from now on. I'll get the laundry and everything done during the day on Saturdays. Can you spend Saturday evenings with me? He nodded slowly. He wanted to spend time with her, so he would. He might have to get up in the middle of the night to write, but that would be nothing new for him. His schedules were never what anyone would call normal anyway. I can make that happen. He took her hand and brought it to his lips. Thank you for giving me another chance. She nodded briefly. She wasn't certain she was giving him another chance so much as doing what she promised to do in the contract. But she wouldn't break the contract. Before she could say that, their food arrived. She'd work at forgiving him, of course, but trusting? That would be a long time coming. Chapter 6. Addie spent Saturday doing all the chores that had been put off during the week. Now that she realized they had more money to work with, she would set up laundry pickup and delivery for the following week, but it was just too late to mess with it. She spent the morning in a laundromat around the corner from the apartment, reading one of her husband's books. It was strange to realize that they were his as she read, but she was starting to like the idea. The stories that she loved had been created in the mind of the man she'd married. When she looked at him, she saw him differently. Maybe that was why he hadn't told her. Maybe he didn't want her to see him differently. When she got home, he was still tapping away at his keyboard, which was no surprise. She was starting to think the man wasn't happy unless his fingers were typing away at something. She put the laundry away, and then pulled out her laptop to order their groceries for the week. She cleaned the bathroom while waiting for the groceries, and when the groceries arrived, she put them away, made sandwiches for both of them, putting his beside him on the desk, and started dinner in the crock pot. She cleaned the entire apartment around him, and he only spoke to her when he got up to go to the bathroom. She was amazed that he could be so focused on something that nothing seemed able to penetrate the mental walls he built up around himself. She wasn't certain if his intense focus made him admirable or just plain annoying. Either way, he was hers for the long haul. She didn't believe in divorce. Asterisk. Addie enjoyed introducing Jake around at church on Sunday. Part of her wanted to scream that he was the famous science fiction writer, Roger Holiday, but most of her recognized that would make him uncomfortable. He was simply Jake, her husband. No one had known she was getting married, because she hadn't wanted to have a huge number of people at her wedding. With 3 sisters and 3 brothers, and their families, the wedding had been big enough already. Matrimony had brought in the preacher who married them, so she even had to introduce him to her pastor and his wife, both of whom were very welcoming of him. They took a cab to her parents' house afterward. She told him she didn't mind taking the subway, but he shook his head. No point working as hard as I do to take the subway. We'll take a cab. Addie wondered if she'd ever be able to just casually spend more money than she needed to on something, just because she had it, but the answer was clear to her: she would. She really already had by setting up laundry services. She certainly was able to spend hours every Saturday morning working on their laundry, but why bother? She could throw a little money at it and avoid the task, doing something she enjoyed for a change. When they arrived at her parents' house in Brooklyn, she wished she could make everything magically right between her and Jake, if only for a few hours. Her parents would notice something wasn't right between them. She didn't want to deceive them, but even worse was the idea that they would realize something was amiss. In this case, deception was the only real answer. She stopped on the sidewalk leading up to the house and looked at Jake. My parents need to think everything is perfect between us. I really don't want them to worry. I wish we could skip straight past making your parents think everything is perfect to everything being perfect again. I'll do my best, though. Thanks. She said nothing in response to his wish as they walked up to the house. He'd chosen his path. She'd try, but it was hard to regain trust. If she could do it, she'd snap her fingers and make it happen, but she knew that would never work. Nothing she could think of would. Her father stepped outside as they reached the front door. I was starting to wonder if you two were going to stand out here talking all day. Addie walked into her father's arms, hugging him tightly. She rested her head on his broad shoulder, wishing for a moment he could make everything better for her. She wanted to cry, but she kept a smile on her face as she pulled away. So good to see you, Dad. Billy Myers eyed his youngest child. You happy? She nodded. Jake's a good man. And she knew he was. She just didn't trust him any longer. I'm going to run in and say hi to Mom. She passed her father, unable to withstand his scrutiny for another minute as she hurried to the kitchen. Is there anything I can do to help? Her mother spun around from the sink where she was peeling potatoes. Well, look who the cat dragged in. Carolyn's eyes went up and down her youngest daughter. I guess he didn't kill you after all. Addie had to laugh at that. Did you really think he would? Surely her mother had known she was just being silly about that. Well, how was I supposed to know? I'd never met the man, and neither had you. Why don't I finish peeling the potatoes? I know that's hard on your back. You take a break. It was a smooth change of subject, but more than that? It was the truth. Her mother had injured her back long before Addie was born, and she'd grown up doing her best to keep her mother from doing anything that would make her hurt more than she had to. Carolyn gladly stepped away from the hated chore. I'll set the table. How was that place in South Dakota? Was it nice? She got down plates and glasses as she talked. Oh, it was really amazing. While Addie peeled the potatoes, she described the resort and the way they'd kept it preserved. It was really like stepping back in time. I'd love to go again sometime if I get the chance. I can't imagine anything that would make me feel like I was back in the time period more than that did. Sounds like an interesting place to visit. Maybe I can talk your father into taking me there for our 45th anniversary. I wouldn't mind trying the healing waters for the arthritis in my knees. Or my back either for that matter. Knowing her mother had always been one to go for natural remedies over traditional medicine, Addie wasn't surprised at all. I don't know if there will be any real healing benefits, but I know you'll enjoy it. Carolyn smiled. I'm sure I'll enjoy it. Any time spent with your father is good time. From anyone else, the words would have sounded false to Addie, but she knew her mother meant them. Her parents got on each other's nerves at times, but they always loved and stood by each other. I don't have any idea what it costs. Jake paid for it. Carolyn eyed her daughter. He should have paid for it. Are you two having money issues? Not in the way you mean. We have plenty. Addie swore to herself she wouldn't say another word. She didn't want her mother to know how her husband had deceived her. Oh. I thought he was a writer, Carolyn said with surprise. Was her mother where she got the notion that writers were all struggling and none of them could support themselves? He is. He's a famous science fiction writer. He's my favorite writer actually. Addie tried to sound like it was every day a girl married her favorite writer. I had no idea. I won't worry so much about him murdering you then. Do you think famous people can't be murderers? I'm not sure why you think that way, Mom. Look at Phil Spector. He killed his wife. He was famous. Carolyn frowned at Addie. Are you trying to make me worry more? No, I'm not. I just don't think you should believe someone is good just because they're famous. Not everyone famous is good, just like not everyone who's not famous is bad. Her mother's ideas about life amazed Addie at times. But there's less of a chance he'll kill you. Isn't there? He's not going to kill me. Don't worry about that so much. Addie shook her head at her mother as she put the potatoes on the stove. What else can I do? Get the pot roast out of the oven and whip up some gravy. Carolyn walked to the table and sat down. I need to sit for a few minutes. Her back issues made it so she couldn't be in any position for long. Addie grabbed some oven mitts, removed the roast, and started the process of making gravy. Has Dad talked any more about doing consulting work for the city? He's decided against it. He likes not having to wake up to the alarm clock for a change, and he decided he doesn't want to give that up. I can understand that. Addie hated mornings herself, but they were a necessary evil. Heather's having a baby. Heather was Addie's second oldest sister. They're really hoping for a girl this time. Addie smiled. After 4 boys, I would expect so. Why else would they be having a 5th? Your sister loves being a stay-at-home mom, just like I was. Do you think there's any chance you'll stay home once children start coming? Carolyn didn't think women should work once the babies started coming. She thought it was fine and dandy to have a career, but not if you had children. Everything should be given up at that point. Addie shook her head. No chance at all. I have a store to run. I love what I do. There's no need for me to stay home. How many times did she have to explain it to her mother? She was choosing a career. Yes, she'd have a family when she was ready, but that didn't mean she had to stay home with the children. Will Jake take care of the baby while you're at work? I think we'll probably just hire a nanny, but we're not even planning on thinking about it yet. Not for at least a year. Addie knew her mother wanted more grandkids, but she had 15 and 2 more on the way. She could wait. Gravy's done. Do you want the potatoes mashed? Yeah, go ahead and mash them, please. As soon as she was finished, Addie put a big bowl of mashed potatoes on the table. She added the gravy, meat, and carrots. She filled glasses for everyone before calling the two men to eat. "I hope you're hungry. Mom cooked enough to feed an army." Billy and Jake seemed to be engrossed in conversation. "We're coming." Billy looked at Jake. "My wife is going to make me eat this as leftovers for a week if you don't eat a lot and rave about it. Then she'll send some home with you. I don't care if you throw it away, just don't make me eat it forever." "Yes, sir." Jake winked at Addie. "I'm going to rescue your father from the leftovers," he whispered. Addie shook her head. "Mom's going to figure it out, and then you'll be on her poop list too." Jake's eyes twinkled as he asked, "Poop list? Really?" She shrugged. "You know what I mean. I don't use those words, and I especially don't use them in my mama's house." He chuckled, putting a hand to the small of her back. She wanted to push it away, because she was still annoyed with him, but she didn't want her parents to know there was anything wrong between them. When they were all seated, her father said a prayer for them. When Jake's hand found hers under the table, she didn't push him away. Instead, she held tightly to his hand for the prayer. "How are things going at the store, Addie?" Billy asked as he served himself a huge portion of the mashed potatoes. "Oh, really well. Bailey did fine while I was gone. No mistakes that I can find, and she didn't have to call me even once." She took a bite of her roast. "Mom, this roast is great." She had always loved her mother's cooking, and this meal was no exception. "Thanks. It's your dad's favorite." Billy looked at Jake with pleading eyes. Jake took the hint. "This is wonderful, Mrs. Myers. I wish Addie had more time to cook this way." Truly, he was more than satisfied with the food Addie cooked for him. She provided much better than frozen pizza, which was about all he ever fed himself. Carolyn gave Addie a look. "I was just telling her she should plan on staying home once you start having children." Jake wiped his mouth with a napkin. With as angry as Addie still was, he wasn't sure they'd ever be able to have children, because she may never let him touch her again. "I think if and when children arrive, we'll probably get a full-time nanny. I can't take time off work to care for a baby, and I know Addie cares more about her store than that." Carolyn frowned. "You're not even planning to raise your own child?" "I raised you better than that, Addie." Obviously her mother thought shaming her in front of her new husband would make her change her mind. "Yes, you did. But you also raised me to be strong and think for myself. I know what I want, and I want to keep running my store. It makes me happy. Children would make you happier." Jake looked back and forth between mother and daughter. "Addie has the right to choose her own path, Mrs. Myers. You can't expect her to do everything you did, simply because you did it that way." "Well, I never." Carolyn looked more than a little offended by her son-in-law's words. Billy sighed. "Carolyn? Let it go. She has the right to be a store owner or a stay-at-home mom. She also has the right to take up featherweight boxing if she wants to. We raised her right, and now she gets to make her own decisions." Carolyn obviously didn't like her husband's answer, but she didn't say anything else. Addie was relieved. Her mother usually went on and on about how she was doing things wrong, but this time she'd had two defenders. "The food really is wonderful, Mrs. Myers," Jake said again. "Would you mind if we took a bit of it home for lunches this week?" He knew he was being obvious, but maybe she wouldn't say anything. He certainly didn't want to be on her poop list, as Addie so eloquently put it. Carolyn shook her head. Of course not. She never had been, nor would she ever be a woman who turned down a guest in her home. Billy winked at Jake and mouthed the words, "Thank you." Jake pretended not to see it as he continued eating. Once lunch was over, Jake stood. "We should go," he said. Can we take 10 minutes for me to help Mom with the dishes? Addie asked. She knew Jake was in a hurry to get back to work, but she really didn't want to upset her mother by just taking off either. In her mother's house, all the women helped with the cooking, and all the women helped with the dishes. As a child, she'd often protested that the boys should help too, but it had gotten her nowhere, so she just learned to accept it as her lot in life. Jake nodded reluctantly. But then I've got to get back to work. I'll be ready after the dishes. Addie got to her feet and hurried around the kitchen, gathering dishes and putting them into the sink to rinse and get into the dishwasher. Carolyn got to her feet, helping her daughter. You aren't spending your Sunday off together? She asked with a frown. We spent half the day together. He'll work the other half. I've got some paperwork to do for the store. We're a good team because we both work so hard. Addie knew it was true. Lachele had picked a good man for her. She would have gone crazy being married to Scott. Carolyn shook her head. I really don't know how you do it. You're newlyweds. You should be spending every moment you can together. Addie agreed with her mother, so she said nothing. They needed more time together, but they weren't going to get it. He takes a week off every month, and we'll have more time together then. I may arrange my schedule to do the same. Or at least plan a couple of days off during his week off. I guess if he wants to keep making the kind of money he does, he needs to work that hard. Addie frowned. You know, that sounds like he's incredibly money-driven, and I just don't think that's the case. I think he loves his work so much that he's just driven to do it. He needs to work like other people need air. I've never seen anything like it. Carolyn frowned. You really believe that? I really do. Asterisk. As soon as they arrived home, Jake returned to his computer, immediately going back to work. Addie stowed the leftovers in the refrigerator. She'd serve them for dinner the next night. There really was enough for a couple of more meals, and her mother had the leftovers with her. Addie shook her head. Someday her mother would learn that she was no longer cooking for a family of 9. She settled on the couch with her laptop and went through the weekly reports for the store, making the orders that needed to be made. After a while, she glanced up and saw Jake watching her. Is everything all right? He got up and moved to the couch beside her, his arm going around her shoulders. He waited for her to flinch away, but when she didn't, he pulled her close. Do you have a lot more work to do? She shook her head. I'm just finishing up. Why? He took the computer from her lap and placed it on the small coffee table. I just want to talk for a minute, if you don't mind. Not at all. Why was he paying attention to her instead of his computer? What's up? Well, first, I just want to say I'm sorry one more time. After spending 2 days with you, I knew you cared for me even without knowing about the money I made. Telling you before we came home would have been ideal. I shouldn't have waited. She nodded. Thank you for saying that. I felt like you didn't think you could trust me, even after the honeymoon, when I feel like I told you everything. He sighed, pulling her closer and kissing her forehead. Not at all. I'm sorry I made you feel that way. I forgive you. For the first time since she'd discovered who he really was, she felt like she could move on past it. He was saying all the right things. She believed he really meant them. I also wanted to talk about this apartment. Did you sign a long lease? No, I just subleased for 2 months from a friend. I didn't know where we'd end up, and I didn't feel like I had the right to make the decision for us, but Dr. Lachele had given me the impression we'd be living here in Manhattan. So I figured I needed to find us a spot. We couldn't keep living with my 3 roommates, especially since I shared a room with Danielle. Well, this place is pretty small. Would you be willing to look at larger places on my next week off? I'd love to have an office to write in. Then I wouldn't feel like I'm taking up the whole living room. You'd feel like you could make a little more noise, I'm sure. He watched her carefully for a response. She nodded. I think that's a really good idea. We could get a 2 or even 3-bedroom place. Do you want to keep living in an apartment or try to find a house? An apartment for now, I think. Neither of us has time to think about maintaining a lawn or anything. He turned to her more fully on the couch. I hope you didn't mind leaving your parents so quickly. I had this idea for a way I could fix the last scene of my book. You finished? Really? He nodded. Well, I still have to edit it, and I'll add several thousand more words in edits, but I finished the first draft, which for me is the hardest part. You edit your own book? Don't you have an editor? It didn't make sense to her that he would have to go through the slow process of editing his own work when she knew he must have someone who was paid to do it. I do have an editor, but I still edit my own book first. I tend to skimp on details in the first draft, and then I go back and add them. He shrugged. I'll spend the next week or so in edits, and then I'll be done with this one. Will you take some time off when you're done? He nodded. Yeah, I take at least a week off between books. I need to go back to Montana and get the rest of my stuff from my house there. I'll leave the furniture, but I need my books and stuff. Which is another reason why we need a bigger place. I need room for my books. She laughed. Sounds to me like you might need a Kindle. Don't we all? He cupped her face in his hands, leaning over to kiss her softly. I'm so happy to hear you laugh again. I thought I'd blown it for us. I wasn't sure. She looked straight into his eyes. I was really hurt, but I don't want our relationship to be over. Do you want me to take a couple of days off work and go to Montana with you? We could always shop for apartments when we were done. Would you mind? I'd love for you to get to know Scott and Savannah better. And Caden too, I guess, but right now? He just poops a lot. She giggled. Most babies do. I would love to go with you. He leaned over and kissed her again, this time more passionately. His arms wrapped around her and he pulled her close. Want to know what I'd love to do? What? He stood and helped her to her feet, keeping her hand in his as he headed to the bedroom. He pulled off his shirt and sat on the bed, facing her. She stood in front of him. I'll give you 3 guesses. His hands went to her shirt, and he started unbuttoning it before pushing it off her shoulders. You're tired and want to take a nap, she said, with a twinkle in her eye. No. 2 more tries. His unzipped her slacks and pushed them down off her hips. You want to read in bed naked? I'd let you read your book to me. That sounded like a terrific idea to her. 1 more guess. He unclasped her bra and dropped it to the floor. You want to draw smiley faces on my belly? Nope. Wrong 3 times. Now you have to pay the penalty. She frowned. Oh no. What could that penalty be? Why don't I show you? He pulled her down onto the bed with him. Chapter 7. Addie started to live for the day Jake's edits were done. Always she'd lived for her store, but she found she craved his attention. He finished the edits on Friday the following week, so Addie arranged to take the following week off for their trip to Montana and apartment hunting. They'd already been married 4 weeks when they got on the plane to pack up his things. When they landed, Scott and Savannah were waiting at the airport, with Caden sleeping in his car seat at the back of the SUV. Jake climbed into the back seat and let Addie sit in the middle with Caden. You staying at your old house, Jake? Scott asked. Yeah. We have too much to get done to do anything else. Jake sighed. This isn't just a fun trip. He wished it was though. He wished they were staying with Scott and Savannah, so the 2 women could get to know one another better. It would be nice if they were as close as he and Scott were. Savannah turned and looked at Addie. Do you want to come to supper tonight? Or do you want us to go to a grocery store so you'll have food there? You'll be surprised at the lack of delivery places here. Addie smiled. I know New Yorkers are blessed with more delivery places than the rest of the country. I don't mind cooking, but I'd love to come over as well. It would be nice to get to know you and Scott better. She loved what she knew of Savannah. Well, why don't we drop you off to get started? We took Scott's truck to Jake's house, so you'll have something to drive while you're here. Thanks for that, Jake said. We could have rented a car, but this makes it a bit easier. We won't have to take load after load of boxes to be shipped. We can just do it all in 1 or 2 trips with the truck. My truck is your truck. You wreck it? You buy me a new one. Heck, just wreck it toward the end of your time here. I need a new truck anyway. Because they were sitting at a stoplight, Scott looked in the rearview mirror at his friend to see his reaction. I'll buy you an old beat-up truck, Jake told him. Maybe I can find one like you drove in high school. Scott laughed. Oh yeah, that would be awesome. Remember that time we were driving up and down Drag and my truck died, and you had to get out and push? Jake rolled his eyes. I was trying to flirt with girls out the window, and the next thing I knew they were at the next light, and we were still sitting there like a couple of morons. He'd been mortified at the time, but he had no problem laughing about it now. Addie looked at Jake. You were flirting with girls? She tried to sound angry with him, but she couldn't help but smile at the picture of the 2 men stranded while the girls went on. Don't worry, baby. We were barely 16, so you'd have been about 9. It doesn't count if you were prepubescent. Jake winked at her. Savannah turned around from the front seat and looked at Addie. Scott uses that line with me, too. We'll show them differently later. Addie grinned. She and Savannah had spoken on the phone several times, and she was happy to be able to call the other woman a friend. She looked forward to having some face-to-face time with her, and not just phone, texts, and internet. Sometimes you just needed to be able to touch someone. We're really thankful you're willing to cook tonight. It'll save me from having to spend the time. I think we're going to be way too busy to think about eating. Jake says there's only one restaurant to speak of in town. It was mind-boggling to Addie to think about actually living in a place that had so little, but she guessed she could see the appeal of a small town. It would be nice to occasionally run into people she knew around town. Savannah nodded. The diner. There's this waitress who acts like she owns the guys. I think they dated every female within a 200-mile radius. She made a face. I went for an in-service training, and the teacher I was taking over for? Her sister dated Scott, but she didn't. I couldn't believe he'd actually missed a girl in the state of Montana. Addie looked at Jake. Did you have the same number of girls hanging off you as Scott did? Jake shook his head. It was harder to get girls when you were on the tennis team and in the chess club. Scott was a football player. Oh, well, I only liked football players if they were in the chess club too. I was a nerd in high school. I wanted to date the guy who would have a job someday and not a concussion, Addie told them. Savannah laughed. Dr. Lachele really does know what she's doing. Being married to Jake would make me crazy, and I sure couldn't see you giving up your store for Scott. Or him being willing to let you run it instead of being home to cook his dinner every night. I'm still reserving judgment, Addie said with a grin. Hey, you've made it through a month, and you're sitting in a car with each other without wanting to kill anyone. That's pretty impressive. Scott interjected from the front. We've never tried to kill each other, Jake said proudly. He really did feel like it was an accomplishment. We never tried, but I did think about breaking a vase over his head a few times, Savannah said. Addie suppressed a giggle. Did he deserve it? She was sure he had, but it would be nice to hear Scott's side of things. Oh, more than, Scott answered. She's a saint for putting up with me. Well, I wasn't perfect either. No one is. Savannah smiled at Scott. Now that we're through the first year, I think we're going to be just fine. Until I do something so stupid you want to hit me over the head with a vase again? Jake shook his head. Well, stop doing stupid things then. Oh, wait, forgot who I'm talking to. Jake? Scott asked. Yeah? You're a freak. Oh, I wish I had a best friend like that, Addie said to Savannah. I can just feel the love. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we all could? Savannah asked. Addie wasn't certain what she expected when they pulled up to Scott and Savannah's home a few hours later, but it wasn't the big old ranch house that stood proudly in the middle of several outbuildings. It was pretty, in an old-fashioned rustic kind of way, but it was surprising to Addie, who loved New York with everything inside her, that another girl from Manhattan could be so happy in Montana. Once they were inside, Savannah gave Addie a quick tour of the house. This house is certainly full of history, Addie said. Savannah laughed. Yeah, it's old, but I think it's such a beautiful place. I've only been here for a year, but already I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. Scott's great-grandfather built it. It's a wonderful place to raise children, Addie said honestly. Do you still think you'll put off having children until you've been married for a year? Oh, at least. I put in a lot of hours in my store, and Jake's so involved in his writing. I can just see leaving him home alone with a baby, and him not even noticing that the baby cried. Addie sighed. He sure is good at tuning out the world around him. I'm sure it's a skill he needed to learn, but it's crazy. You'll need to hire a nanny if you want to keep working. Jake will never be able to do his share. Savannah opened the door to the baby's room. He's a good man, but he sure doesn't notice the world around him. Addie sighed as she looked at the walls. This is beautiful. Did you quilt this yourself? She asked, referring to a Sesame Street wall hanging. Dr. Lachele did. She said she's going to make something special for each of her matrimony munchkins. Savannah laughed. At first, she kept calling Caden her first matrimony grandbaby, and then she decided matrimony munchkins has a better ring to it. She's never gone back. I haven't had to call Dr. Lachele yet. We had a hard time for a little while, but we worked through it. Addie prided herself on not needing the counselor's help. They were doing just fine by themselves. Savannah raised an eyebrow. You will. Trust me. She's free for your first year. You might as well take advantage. We really haven't needed her. Addie hadn't told anyone about the way Jake had deceived her about his success as a writer, and she didn't plan to start with Savannah. They'd worked through it, and that was really all that mattered. Have you guys said the L word yet? Addie shook her head. We've only been married a month. I'm not ready to say it or hear it. Sure, she enjoyed their time together. She loved the sex. But love? She was a long way from love. You really believe that? Savannah asked. If Jake said he loved you, you'd reject it? Well, no, but I don't know how I'd respond. I mean, he's a great guy, and I like being around him. He's a good husband to me, but that doesn't mean I love him. Addie shrugged. I'd probably say, thank you. Do you resent the time he spends at the computer? Just a little, Addie responded. I work a lot of hours as well. Do you live for your days off together? That doesn't mean anything. Addie protested. You love him. I'd be willing to bet he loves you too, but just hasn't said it yet. Savannah closed the door to Caden's room and headed back down the stairs. Is Jake going to sell his parents' house? You guys would always be welcome to stay here when you come to visit. I'm really not sure. Addie was almost offended that she knew so little about her husband. Oh yeah. His parents are traveling throughout the country in their RV. They have been since Jake finished college. It was always their dream, but they wanted him to have stability as he was finishing college. He graduated, and they were gone the next week. Savannah led the way back to the kitchen. I made bison steaks, baked potatoes, and salad. I hope that's all right. Addie saw the table was already set even as she wrinkled her nose. Bison steaks? Why would you make bison steaks? She didn't even realize there were still buffalo. She thought they were extinct. Because bison are the only cattle indigenous to the United States, they have less fat than beef, don't need to be vaccinated, and have a better taste. Why wouldn't you eat bison? Scott asked from behind her. His arms were crossed over his chest as if he were preparing for a fight. He was obviously passionate about the subject. Jake laughed and walked over, putting his arm around Addie's shoulders. Stop the lecture, Scott. She didn't know you were a bison rancher. Scott looked at Jake incredulously. You didn't tell her? Why wouldn't you say something? Look, man, I know you think being a bison rancher is your identity, and there's nothing else to you, but I just never mentioned what you did other than ranching. I didn't dwell on that. We've only been married a month. I had your life story planned for some time in the 3rd month. He winked at Addie, who grinned up at him. Scott shook his head. We don't eat beef. Only bison. Even Jake eats only bison meat, right, Jake? Addie looked at Jake, wondering how he'd respond to that. For the month she'd known him, he'd eaten a lot of beef. Right, Jake, she echoed. Jake grinned. Scott? It's not easy to find bison meat in other parts of the country. I've been eating beef like it's going out of style. He didn't feel bad about it either. If bison had been readily available, then yes, he'd have chosen it over beef if only to support his friend. But it wasn't, so he hadn't. Scott looked at Jake as if he'd grown 2 heads. Are you kidding me? I feel so betrayed. He shook his head. And beef is out of style. It has been for years. Jake laughed. I'd stay on my no-beef fast if I could find bison elsewhere. You can't really expect me to give up red meat, though. I don't know if I could. He knew his friend had spent very little time outside of the area of Montana where he'd been born and raised. He honestly probably didn't know how hard it was to obtain in other places. Scott shook his head. You could if you wanted to. Addie decided to help her husband out. I'm the one who buys the food, and he eats whatever I cook. I didn't know about the bison meat thing, so really? It's my fault. She wasn't certain why eating bison meat was so important to Scott, but she'd do it, or at least tell him she'd do it, if he'd be quiet about it. I guess I can forgive you, since you didn't know. You'll make sure you buy Montana bison meat from now on instead of beef, though, right? Scott asked. He gave her a look that told her she needed to agree or get out of his house. Addie shrugged. I'll do my best. It never occurred to me to even look to see if my supermarket carried bison. The next time I shop, I'll see if that's on the website. Savannah sighed. I miss shopping for my groceries online and having them delivered. It's hard to take the baby to the grocery store. I've started going on Saturdays so Scott can watch the baby. Of course, since I'm nursing and he won't take a bottle, that means that I have to make sure he eats right before I leave. Scott shrugged. Raising our child without the pollution of New York in a close-knit community is worth the trade-off though, right? I think so whenever I'm not grocery shopping, Savannah replied. She opened the oven and removed the baked potatoes, leaving them atop the stove in their foil wraps. I'm going to get the steaks from the grill, and I'll be right back. She took a platter from the counter and went out to get the steaks, coming back in less than 3 minutes later. Are we ready to eat? I am. Packing is hard work, Addie responded. I'm starving. The table was already set with iced tea at every setting. I'll help with the dishes, Addie told Savannah once they were all seated. No, you can't. You're my guest. Savannah passed a bowl with the potatoes, still in their foil, to Addie. I couldn't let you help. Addie laughed. In the house I grew up in, you help with dishes, or you go hungry. Well, the girls had to help at least. The boys were above that. She rolled her eyes, letting her friend know what she thought of the gender inequality in her parents' home. Savannah shook her head. Caden is going to know how to do dishes. All men should know how. Addie added butter and cheese to her baked potato. I agree. Savannah glared at Scott as if she wanted him to argue with her about it. Scott wisely stayed silent.